Nvidia third quarter earnings came in as expected, and the stock has been up maybe 0.5%. So it's really a non-event. And the reason it's a non-event is because the company delivered on almost every front that they could deliver. They beat expectations. They said a few good things about Blackwell, and in general, they were very positive. And I think given the stock performance this year, up about 170%, and the general valuation of the company, which by the way is not that high actually, but still, just given the performance of the stock, one has to, I guess, conclude that this is the best that the market is this is the best the market is willing to pay right now. Typically a sign that there's a bit of a saturation in buying, there's a bit of a sort of pause. Now, we don't see it that way. We think the risk at Nvidia is continuously to the upside. In other words, people are underestimating the potential and they're overly concerned about the downside, which is fair. I mean, when the stock does what Nvidia has done in the last years, that you have to ask yourself, well, is this even sustainable? And the reason this is sustainable is because the company is just at a crossroads of a couple of gigantic events. This is like, wave theory. When big waves collide and interfere, much bigger waves happen. If you've ever surfed in a wedge type situation where there's backwash and then the wave comes from this side and the backwash comes from the front, and then the wave can double within seconds. So it's kind of like that. Now, if you look at the numbers themselves, the stock actually looks fairly reasonable. We have over 100% growth year over year. According to our model, we're pricing in roughly 40% growth for the next 5 years, and the fair value of the stock is around 180. So it's still below that threshold. Looking at PE ratio of around 54, price to sales of around 40. The difference is not very high because the margins are extremely high. So this all looks fairly reasonable. Now, why are people skeptical? Because you could say, well, look, if they can continue with the kind of sales growth and the kind of margin growth and the kind of, or if they can keep their 75% margin, and keep growing sales and have the kind of operating leverage that they have, then the stock is not expensive. But can this continue? And I think this hinges on two things. One is demand, and the other is, of course, supply. And maybe a third one, which is competition. And as far as the company is concerned right now, to best of our knowledge, all of these three factors are going in one way, which is in their way. And that's why we believe that the risk is to the upside. This is not even on podcast. It's November 21st, 2024. This is Krim Delco. For the day, the fund is down 75 basis points. The market's up 55 basis points. For the year, we're up 65.3%. The market's up 24.2%. We're outperforming by 41.1%. So let's talk about the earnings. I think the main message, like I said in the prelude, is that we have these three gigantic vectors all going into one direction. We have demand, we have supply, and we have competition, and they're all going Nvidia's way. So let's go one by one and discuss them. Let's start with demand. Why is there so much demand for the Nvidia products? The answer is AI. Now, what does AI mean? AI means, in particular, tokens. So what tokens means is that at the current state-of-the-art AI model infrastructure, the way that AI models are trained is that data is being tokenized, and then those tokens are stored in a latent space and then queried either through Gen AI or through some sort of search engine or a mix of it, like RAG, which is retrieval augmented generation. So either way, what you're doing is you take information from the real world, whether it's through the internet or from physical world, and you tokenize that information, and then you store it, and then you query it as per those tokens. So what Nvidia is doing is generating a factory for tokens, I'm going to talk about supply in a second, but let's stay with demand. So why is there so much demand for these tokens? It's because we have noticed that if we have lots and lots and lots and lots of tokens that represent some objective truth of reality, then we can query that reality and use it for our purpose, whether it's to understand how to organize a company based on the projected sales figures, whether it's to understand how the CIA should act given the information that is available in terms of terror attacks, or whether it's, let's say, an insurance company that is pricing its insurance premiums. This is knowledge that can be derived through analysis, and that analysis can be enhanced with AI, and that AI requires token generation. Now, what Nvidia is touting, or the big growth factor of Nvidia, according to Jensen, the CEO, is that we will also penetrate the real world. And what that means is, and this is something that we at Orange Capital Partners have been working on for, probably years at this point, but definitely in the last year, in terms of, attending lectures at universities, going to conferences, reading papers, and all of that. And that is the real world. And what does that actually mean? Now, representing the real world from an engineering perspective is not very dissimilar from what, let's say, OpenAI did when they trained ChatGPT. Why do I say that? Well, what did OpenAI do when they trained ChatGPT? They applied a massive general model to a lot of data, in this case internet data, and they taught the model how to, or they stored knowledge. They stored a comprehensive set of knowledge that was gathered from the internet in latent space, tokenized, so it's queryable, and that's what Gen AI has become. Now, the same thing can be done with physics. It's just that now we have more dimensions, we have more degrees of freedom, a lot more degrees of freedom, but in principle, it's the same thing. We have the knowledge of the world, we have a room with chairs and bottles on a chair, and these bottles can fall down, they break if they fall, that's physics. All of these things can be learned, all of these things can be stored in tokenized form and queried per token if necessary. So that's the idea. What that means in practice is that we're going to have what Nvidia calls Omniverse, which is a set of models and architectures and configurations that help users simulate the real world in physics. That's what it means. And in Jensen's words, the Omniverse is the next Cuda, Cuda is a software platform that has enabled this massive revolution of AI based on GPUs that started around 2007 and then has grown ever since. And this Omniverse is the next software platform which should allow the AIification of the physical world. Again, in practice, this means, for example, here's a couple of examples which are already in use. So let's say SpaceX wants to build Starship, and one of the biggest problems of Starship is heat resistance while re-entry from out of orbit into the atmosphere of the world, of Earth. So that heat shield has to be incredibly strong, it has to be resistant, and it has to be able to be used many, many times, because the idea of Starship is to be able to be launched all the time. What that means is that we need to find ways to design this. And one way to design this, of course, is to do what people have been doing for decades, which is use the knowledge of physics that we have and, at the best of our knowledge, design materials that can resist the kind of heat and stress and all of that goes with re-entry. The problem with that is that we just don't know as much about the actual real world, and therefore we have to be able to iterate. And this is very expensive. Imagine, you have to launch the thing, re-enter, and then see what happens. And the problem is also, if you want to have a system that can re-enter maybe 1,000 times, well, you can't really iterate, and it's just too expensive, it takes too long. So what's the solution? In simulation. In simulation, you can re-enter millions of times and see what happens to the particular heat shield. Now, you might ask, well, fine, so why don't we simulate them? Well, the problem is twofold. One is we don't have actually threefold. We don't have the hardware, we don't have the software, and we don't have the data. So we're working on all of these three things. Now, what Nvidia is delivering is the hardware and the software. The data is coming from companies like SpaceX. That's why SpaceX is launching Starship so many times. I don't know, we have about, I don't know how many launches we had so far. But this is exactly what they're doing, gathering data. Now you have this data from the real launches, and hopefully you can use that data then to train a model to simulate another 1,000 or 10,000 Starship launches. This is the idea. Extrapolate this to any other situation. For example, self-driving cars. Imagine if self-driving cars could be simulated before they get deployed on the road and learn how to drive. Maybe are not perfect, but they could definitely pre-train and be very good. There's an example that I discussed a while ago. It's the drone race that was discussed by a professor from Zurich. The drones were competing with humans in a race, and they were fully trained in simulation, and then only sort of the last mile, if you will, they were fine-tuned for the real world, and then the sim-to-real transfer actually worked really well, and the drones fully autonomously beat any human. So there's already examples in the real world where simulation works well. We've also spoken with the CTO of ANSYS about physics simulation. So this is a field that is growing and that is incredibly interesting, and in my opinion is certainly opening up the door for all these massive tokenized token demand pockets that are to be expected. So demand, very large. What is supply? Supply, in a nutshell, can be said is we need to be able to provide as many tokens per dollar as we can, or as many tokens per watt as we can. So this is a per something problem. Why is that important? It's important because you have a lot, and this is going to touch on the third subject, which is competition. You have a lot of people who will say, well, we can do what Nvidia is doing. We can do this, we can do that, all of that. Yes, of course you can. Nobody is disputing that. The problem is, can you do it at the same cost? And what Nvidia is doing is really building a sort of an AWS of tokenization, or a factory of tokenization, a massive Golden Gate Bridge for tokenization, a massive infrastructure that costs a lot of money to build and costs a lot of money to buy, but once you have it, the output per dollar or per watt is so high that nobody else can compete. So this is why we believe people are still underestimating Nvidia, because they're in a unique position to deliver something that is incredibly useful to almost anybody on Earth, whether it's companies, data center providers, the hyperscalers, the AWSs and the Azures of the world, the internet companies like Facebook and Google. So all of these people have a tremendous insatiable demand. And we can throw in there also companies like Tesla and GE and Rolls-Royce and all these big engineering companies that, in my opinion, are just scratching the surface of what's possible. And then also, let's take the whole life science space, although there we first need some reforms in terms of making it less corrupt, and then hopefully engineering practices will also penetrate that space. So that brings us to the last one, which is competition, which is, I think I've already covered through the supply side of things. You can never say never. There will be competition eventually somewhere, but right now it's hard to fathom that. It will happen, there's no question about it. But what Nvidia has built is this massive factory of token production that per dollar and per watt is just unbeatable, and that's the key. So for right now, we're fine. We will obviously monitor this. There's always a risk of a competition coming from left field, but we don't see it right now. And to our best of our knowledge, also the situation in which Nvidia is, which is they're building on scale, and they're building on parallelism, and they're building on scaling. Just let's say one interesting tidbit from the conference call is the scaling, which was that according to Jensen, you have first you have the training of the models, and that is just pure raw volume, and then you have the fine-tuning of the models. And reinforcement learning with human feedback was the first step, which really made models like ChatGPT actually as good as they are. But then the big breakthrough is reinforcement learning through AI feedback, and things like Strawberry, which is an OpenAI reasoning model, which are automated reasoning technologies, and that of course opens a whole new structure, and again makes the whole process of intelligence a function of Moore's law, and this is the key. So what Nvidia is doing is systematically replacing fine-tuning and tinkering and bespoke solutions with large general models applicable in large parallel systems. And that is, to paraphrase Richard Sutton's bitter lesson, that is exactly what Sutton was predicting. That is what people at OpenAI, people at Nvidia, people at Tesla are saying, which is if you find ways to increase the amount of data and generalize the models and train, you get better results than any kind of other bespoke. So this is the kind of scaling that Nvidia is facing, and I think it's not to be underestimated that the CEO, Jensen, is also incredibly knowledgeable about AI. This is a fact that I think sometimes people oversee. If you take whether it's Larry Ellison at Oracle or Satya Nadella at Microsoft, and you can go down the list. Most CEOs are not very knowledgeable of AI. They know how to throw phrases around, but when it really comes down to the nitty-gritty, and just to paraphrase one, in my opinion, one of the most important sentences of the earnings call was Jensen saying that he actually reads archive papers. This is huge. This is the CEO of the largest value company in the world, and he reads academic papers. Just let that sink for a second. And then ask yourself, why is it that this guy's been able to build this company? And as far, just on a side note, it's a company that actually nobody really hates. Normally when companies grow that big, everybody starts hating them. Amazon, Tesla, Microsoft. But this one, no. And I think it's because Jensen's genuinely interested in scientific and technological solutions. He is still the child playing in the sandbox, just that this sandbox has become a trillion-dollar company. There's a couple of things that I would say help Nvidia also on the way. For example, the crypto bonanza, Bitcoin at $100,000 helps. It's not as crucial anymore because Bitcoin has, I think, moved away from general GPU solutions towards dedicated ASICs. But with Blackwell, there's a good opportunity maybe to also use Blackwell or parts of it for Bitcoin mining. So there's a couple of maybe underlying vectors also that help, or smaller vectors that help Nvidia, but really the big three, once again, there's a gigantic demand for tokens. Nvidia has the best cost and energy budget for tokens on the supply side, and therefore also the least competition. So to summarize, we believe the risk is still to the downside. As good as the stock has done and as amazing as the performance has been, this is still a lot of wealth can be created here. And that's because AI is driven by Jensen's law. Jensen said we can double performance every year, We can halve the energy consumption per token, and that is driving better AI. And people want AI. So people want something that Nvidia can do at the best cost and best energy budget in the world. Nobody can compete with them because they've made some company-defining decisions, such as, for example, investing in Cuda and then investing in Omniverse, investing in interconnect, things along those lines that make it very difficult for competitors to compete for the whole package. There's going to be certain ASIC type solutions for certain specific problems, but if you're a customer, you're better off buying the whole thing or attaching it to, let's say, something like an AWS and using the AI generation there because that's what you really have.